Hi, and welcome again to the CDFM study group. My name is Helen Thomas. We are going to be wrapping up CDFM Module 1, and as I mentioned, the wrap-up will not include the page numbers because the idea behind the wrap-up is that you have already studied, we walked through the review, and now you're ready to kind of test yourself to see your knowledge. So I'm just going to run through the sections and then kind of give some highlights in the areas that you should have covered. All right, so we talked about, when we did the review, we talked about the Secretary of Defense as being in charge of 3 military departments, 4 armed services, and 16 defense agencies. So that was something we talked about in the second competency area. And when it comes to manpower, the priority for programming goes to the combatant command. And if you remember from I think it was like module 2 for those who've already studied ahead, is that operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. So it's important to understand that the resources are also aligned. So the combatant commander priorities are more important than your TDA, your installations. So major commands have the priority for programming manpower. When we talked about manpower, we looked at the presidential authority. What are some of the things when it comes to manpower that the president is allowed to do outside of getting permission from Congress? Well, the president has an authority under Title 10 U.S. Code. He has the authority to activate reserve forces. However, there are some conditions that must be met. So what are those conditions? Yes, it must be either a weapons of mass destruction threat, a terrorist attack, or a threat of terrorist attack. So those are the 3 conditions where which the president is allowed to activate reserve forces without going to Congress. However, there's also some limitation. It can be no more than 365 days, and those personnel will come from the selective reserve and individual ready reserve. The restriction there is not more than 200,000 selective reserve and individual ready reserve. And of that 200,000, no more than 30,000 can be from the IRR, the individual ready reserve. So remember that with presidential authority to activate reserve forces. When we talk about the full-time equivalent terminology, FTEs, we talked about turnover rate, full-time permanent rate, fill rate, lapse rate. Ensure that you know the definition and how to calculate those rates, because I guarantee you'll get some exercises where you have to calculate, let's say, the turnover rate. In order to calculate it, you will have to know the definition. For instance, turnover rate is the number of employees that left positions during the past year divided by the total number of positions. And whenever you see it asks for a rate typically means the answer needs to be a percentage. So know that it's the smaller number divided by a bigger number. So even if you don't remember the exact formula, it's the smaller number divided by the larger number will give you the rate. Be careful, because on the exams, they typically give you more information than you need to do your calculation. So that's why it's essential for you to understand the definitions for yourself, because they'll give you probably a list of all the numbers associated with all the terminology and only ask you to calculate the turnover rate, for instance. So be mindful of that. Under Title V of the U.S. Code, which means a law, there are various separation incentives. So you either have the voluntary separation incentive or voluntary early retirement. So either you're offered money to leave the federal service or you're offered some type of incentive to retire early. And the restriction there, just remember, 25,000. So the Department of Defense is permitted no more than 25,000 separations per year. Along with that, it requires that buyout payments the lesser of $25,000. So it's either $25,000 total or $25,000 or the lesser of your severance pay. That's what you're going to get paid to leave the service. It says an employee accepting a buyout cannot be reemployed with the federal government for at least a year, 12 months after receiving the buyout or that incentive. So if you accept that incentive to leave federal service, you can wait out a year and then you can apply back to come in. If you apply back within that 12 months, then you'll have to pay back the money that you received. And when we talked about manpower, we also talk about commercial activity, or commercial meaning a vendor or contractor doing a job versus government entity doing a job. So what OMB circular talks about commercial activity? That's OMB circular A76. So if you got A76, that is correct. So each agency, so that's Department of Defense and the other departments, are required to submit a list of their government resource agencies not later than the end of the third quarter of each fiscal year. So they were required to submit a list to the director of OMB, and that list includes all the activities performed by government sources for the executive agency. So going back with those terms, OMB Circular A76, it either talks about a commercial activity, which is a vendor, contractor, is what we know them by, or the function is inherently governmental, meaning only government employees are allowed to do whatever that job entails. So let's look at the cost comparison. How do we determine whether to go to a contractor versus keeping the function inherently governmental? In order to understand that, we must understand a few terms. One, which most of us should be familiar with, is the PWS, or the Performance Work Statement. That is the document that details all the technical requirements necessary to accomplish the job. So that's the document that's given to a vendor, to contractors, for them to determine if they can fulfill the functions of that job, and then they will tag a price on it and bid on that particular contract. On the opposite side, the government also must come up with a government estimate of how much it'll cost to utilize government employees to accomplish that job. And so the manpower management, that government organization, is called the MEO, Most Efficient Organization. So you're going to do a cost comparison between the most efficient organization, the MEO, and the contractor by them utilizing the Performance Work Statement, which details the same exact functions that needs to get done. So the idea between the A76 study is it begins with Congress being notified, because it's going to affect a whole lot of people. Once Congress gives the go-ahead to initiate the study, then two things happen. So one, the Performance Work Statement is sent out for bids, for contractors to review it, and they each will provide a bid on how much it'll cost them or cost the government for the contractors to do the job. The second thing is the most efficient organization study is conducted. So a government cost estimate is then developed to determine the manpower necessary, the cost, the equipment, everything necessary to do the job. So in the end, you will have a cost for the most efficient organization, and you'll have a cost from the bids, from the vendors, the contractors. Then there will be a cost comparison between the two. The key to determining which one will receive the bid is what it states is the commercial activity must be at least 10% less than the government entity doing the job in order for that contractor to even be considered. So understand there are other factors involved, because if there's a specific function that's already by law stated that only government employees can do the job, then an A76 study will not be necessary. But if it is necessary, then those are the conditions. Commercial activity must be at least 10% less in cost to even be considered to replace the government entity. So the length of the process for A76 study can run from a year, 12 months, up to 18 months, and of course this probably can be extended depending on what needs to be done. If the process needs to be streamlined, it can be done within 90 days. And for an example of being streamlined, remember when 9/11 happened, and initially we had this military police guys on the gates, and then once the war kicked off and we needed those soldiers elsewhere, then you saw that transition where contractors were shortly thereafter placed on the gates, so the soldiers can go do what they were intended to do. And so that was a streamlined process. It didn't take a year because we recognized that the need for those individuals was great, so we had to do the switch right away. So that's an instance or an example of a streamlined method for that A76 study. Some ethical areas of study when it comes to financial management is we're not allowed to accept gifts from a contractor that's a $20 value or more. So we can accept gifts if they're $20 or less, let's put it that way. However, we cannot exceed $50 in a year. So you can accept a pen, it's less than $20 value, but they can't keep coming in and giving you different gifts that total over $50. So where the gift is based solely on a family relationship. So maybe I grew up with someone that currently works in a contractor for the government, and they give me a gift because, hey, I haven't seen you in a while, I bought this for you, because you know them on a personal level outside of that position you may. But the bottom line is to accept any gift. If you think there's going to be an issue with you accepting the gift, go to your ethics lawyers and individuals and get it in writing that you notify them of the situation and whatever they advise you to do. Gifts between employees is another ethical dilemma that we deal with sometimes. And when it comes to financial management, it talks about gifts from subordinates to a superior or to a supervisor. So there's a 10 limit cap on donation that an employee may donate to someone that's senior to them. So $10 limit. You can, are permitted food and refreshment that's shared in the office. So you can't just buy food for your area. So we just got to understand if it doesn't make sense, most likely it's not. So the bottom line with the gifts, the total value of a gift to a superior should not exceed a $300 value. If you think that your job is going to interfere with some type of personal financial connection that you have with a contractor, is there different remedies where you notify your legal folks, you've got it in writing, they may recommend that you divest or recuse yourself, meaning you separate yourself from that contractor, or you just sell your or diverse your financial connection. All right, so what happens if I'm currently working for the government and then I have interactions with a contractor and then I decide to leave the federal government? What is the timeline for me to accept a job if that contractor that I was working with now offers me a job? In the capacity that I was working, if I'm working and trying to get a job with a civilian contractor, after leaving federal service, there's a 2-year waiting period that should happen, must happen by law, 2 years to wait before I can start working for that contractor. The term honoraria, that means, can I accept gift if, let's say I graduated from the University of North Carolina and I'm an alumni, and the